So I'm going to give it just like maybe another minute or two for anybody else to join, and then we're going to get started. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. So last week we talked a little bit about entities and how to define them, and the JavaScript programming language and JSON, the format that this is all stored in. And we talked primarily about entities and modifying their behavior. So this week I want to kind of switch to, let's talk about resource packs and how we create new items, and potentially if we have time we'll get into creating new mobs and how to animate them and stuff. If not, we'll do that next episode, and then the following episode we will move on to the JavaScript programming language and how to write client-side and server-side scripts. So I'm going to drop the location for the folder that all of this stuff is stored in again inside of the chat for everybody. I have just a kind of like a quick shortcut over here because I'm in and out of it so much. So we'll do a little bit of going over what we did last week. So inside of this long folder, we have our development behavior packs and development resource packs, where we're going to put the add-ons that we're working on in, and that's how we're going to load them into the game. So this week we're going to be working on resource packs. We'll actually work on our behavior pack too, because when it comes to items, we're going to need to actually do some behavior stuff as well. So this is the vanilla resource pack. I'm going to drop links again here in case you weren't here for last episode. I'm going to drop links to where you can download these vanilla resource packs and behavior packs, which have definitions for kind of all of the entities and things that already exist in the game, and they make for really, really great references on how to get started. So inside of our resource pack, we kind of have some of the same thing we did last time. So we have our pack icon, which is just a PNG file for the image that's going to show up if we create a world. That is just this icon here. Then we have our manifest file, and our manifest file defines our add-on. It's what separates it from everything else. So if we look at a manifest file, I'm just going to go ahead and close this out. And I'm going to open this whole directory inside of code, just because we'll go back and forth between behavior packs and resource packs and the vanilla ones for reference. So it's going to be easier to just sort of have that whole directory here for myself. This is the VS Code editor. If you're not using an editor, this is a great free editor that you can use. So let's go into our resource pack and this vanilla one and take a look at this manifest file. So in here, we're just defining the version of this manifest schema that is being used. Inside the header, we have a few things like the description, its name, the version our add-on is at, as well as the minimum game version that needs to be installed for this add-on to work. This UUID is a unique identifier that we need to generate for our add-ons. So let me get a browser window over here for us. Okay, so we can go to uuidgenerator.net, and we're going to need two. And this is how we can generate some UUIDs for our mod so that we can have a unique one. This has to be different from every other add-on. So in order to create our add-on, whether it's a resource pack or a behavior pack, we have to have this manifest file with unique identifiers. So I've already done that inside of my mod. Here's my manifest with my UUID. Then once we have that, we can get started. So we have a few different directories in here, and we'll kind of, I guess, go through them. I'm going to have to bounce around for some of them to make sense. So we'll start with maybe down here with some of the JSON files. So we have the sounds.json file, and this defines the individual sounds that are available in the game and what they're called and the volume that they should be at. We have blocks, and this is where we're defining the individual block types that we have. And on here, it's referencing what texture is on the individual faces of a block. And we'll talk a little bit more about that if you're not really familiar with the 3D drawing or rendering world. The faces are the individual sides. And then we're not going to look at biomes too much, but this kind of changes up some of the parameters for individual biomes. So then we have this UI folder. Now the UI folder are like if you think about an inventory screen or a crafting table, the pop-up window that you get. This is where we define those components. We have textures, and we kind of have them grouped. So if we wanted to look things up, we could say, we could look at an acacia trapdoor, for example. And this is just a PNG file of an image that's going to get rendered onto it. And there's some slight differences. So you might have a texture file that's an individual face, but we might also, if you look at some of the other textures when we get into things like entities, it might look like really crazy and not actually look anything like the thing you're looking at in game, because you're going to have a bunch of the textures for different things like the eyes and a saddle or something like that, all jammed into one image. And I suppose we could look at that really quick too. So we'll just look at an entity, for example, like a creeper. And we can see that this is just like this random texture, right? So we can kind of see the creeper's face hidden in here, but the image itself doesn't look like a creeper. And they do that just to keep the kind of image sizes small. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit, how we can create these. Okay, so moving on up. This directory is called texts. Now this is translations. So the game is obviously available in many different languages, and this is how the game knows what to call an item for any given language. So if we look up the English language, we can see we have sort of like this object called item, which item, the apple, and then we have individual properties on it that we can do. So what is its name, right? And then we could go look that up in another language, and we can see here. So we'll need to create this file, definitely for any items. This directory is where our sounds are actually held. A render controller. Now this, I don't know whether we'll get into this episode, but this is basically helping the game determine how your entity or item should be rendered, which geometry to use, what materials and textures, and whether or not there's an overlay. So say like if something flashes. We're going to talk about items mostly here, which we won't need these render controllers for. These are more for 3D elements. Particles, so if we think about like blocks breaking, things scattering, fire, smoke, all of these things are particles, and this is how we define those. Then we have our models. And models kind of have these geometry settings, and we can break up something into multiple pieces, like its head or its leg or its body and things like that. And we'll look at kind of like a 3D modeling software to see this, but this is where these things are located in reference to their center point, the size, and then the UV is when we look at the textures, how do we find out which portion of that texture file is what gets rendered on top of this particular cube? And the reason these things are broken up like this, we'll see, is when we get into things like animation. So we can look at individual entities. So like a chicken, for example. And we can see inside its bones, we have its body, its head, right? Beak, its legs, its wings, things like that. We could open this inside of an editor if we'd like. So let's go in here and look at, let's just pull up a creeper. And I'm going to open it inside of a program called BlockBench, which is completely free. You can get that at, I think it's blockbench.net. Yes, blockbench.net. So inside here, we actually have geometry for 2 different creepers. We're just going to import this really quick, and we're going to use this texture file. And then we can kind of see what the creeper looks like. So we can click on individual components, and here's the UV mask we can see. So here's the center, and that folds in the different directions in the top. And then all of these things, when we're looking at them, are going to have 3. And this is your X, Y, and Z. So when we look at 3D objects, we have 3 different areas we can move, right? So we have our X-axis, we have our Y-axis, and then this blue one back here, if we rotate, that is our Z-axis. And please stop me if you have any questions, and we can walk through this. So we may come back to our creeper. I think if we make it through creating our custom item, we'll come back and maybe make ourselves like a multi-headed creeper or something like that. I don't even have the sidebar here. And I can walk through BlockBench a little bit more as well if you're into modeling your own software or modeling your own things. So we're just going to discard this for now. Okay. Moving up, these are just entity definitions. And this is just where we define it, give it its identifier, and tell it which textures are going to be used. Attachables, these are things that we can attach to an entity, like armor and things like that. Animations are how we visibly see something walk, see something attack. So if we look at, say, like a chicken, for example, remember I talked about the bones and why you want to have the individual components, and this is where it becomes important. This has a little bit of code in it, and we're not going to get to animation right now just because I want to get to programming first. So we'll probably double back to that. But you can kind of look at this as when this animation occurs, we need the body to rotate. And these are parameters for telling it where it's going to rotate to. And so in this case, so when the chicken does the baby transform animation, we're going to make the head bigger. Okay. And then we have our animation controllers. And then our animation controllers kind of just sort of define states that these things can get into. And we're not going to go in depth on these maybe next episode. We might have to like double back to this just because I think when we get into animation, we're going to start doing programming. Okay, so now that we have all of that defined, let's create our own item. So the first thing we're going to do is inside of our mod directory, and you're going to create inside of your development resource packs folder, you're going to create your own mod, you're going to drop an icon, you're going to create the manifest and the unique UUIDs. Then we're going to add an items folder in there. I already have one in here. Just because this isn't really well documented. We've been using, let's see, we've been using Bedrock.dev, and there's not a lot of documentation for this specific part. So I just left this in here. So we've got like normal, we have the format version for this JSON schema, a Minecraft item, its description. We have to have a unique identifier, which you should, like last time we talked about having a namespace, you should create your own namespace. So if you're using really ambiguous terms, the game knows how to identify yours versus another. So in this case, we've got a category of equipment. We're going to attach a couple components to it so that we know what the icon will be. And then its render offset is tools so that we know how the hand should hold it. So once we have that, we need our textures. In order to do our textures, inside the textures folder, we can come down here and we have this item texture.json file. And this is how we define the individual items and what textures they have. So we're just going to copy this first portion of this. And then we're going to come back into our mod, and we're borrowing all this from that vanilla resource pack. We're going to come back into our mod, and under textures, we're going to create a new file and call it item texture.json. We need to make sure we close that and close that. Right? Yes. Okay. So our item is called an obsidian sword. And we're going to put our texture inside that textures items obsidian sword. And you don't need to put the extension because the file is actually going to be a PNG file. But you don't have to supply that. It just sort of knows how to do that. Okay, so once we do that, make sure it's in the right place. Textures, right? Yes. Okay. So now we have our item defined, we have the texture defined, and now we have a couple of other things that we need to do in order for this to happen. So the first thing we need to do is create that texture. And what we're going to do is we're going to base ours. If we come back up a level and we'll look at the vanilla resource pack, we can go into textures, items, and then we're just going to come in here and grab the diamond sword. And we're going to open it with a program that you should have already on your Windows 10 device called Paint 3D. If you want to do more advanced stuff, you can, of course, buy things like Photoshop. I have Photoshop on here. But for this, we're just going to do a couple basic things. So I'm going to also open up blocks. Nope. Just so that we have kind of our color palette. I'm going to come down and find obsidian. We passed it. Here we go. All right. Now we're going to open this with Paint 3D as well. So what we can do now is we've got our diamond sword here. Diamond sword here. And then we've got our obsidian that we'll put just over here for a second. Okay. Oops. And that went full screen on me. Okay. Wow, this really wants to go full screen. All right. So in here, what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to this pixel pen. That's going to allow us, when we color something, it colors just the pixel and not anything to the outside. We're going to set our thickness to 1 pixel. because we want just one block. And then we're going to come over here and we're going to sample some colors. So we'll take this little eyedropper and we want this purple color. If we click on it, we can get the color code for this. If anybody's curious, we can talk about what this means. It's written in hexadecimal, and we can talk about how that's actually calculated. But effectively, it represents its red, green, and blue color values. So we'll paste that in there, and then we'll just sort of come in and color some pixels. Maybe we'll take some black, put some black down here. And then we can keep doing this till we get our sword. Rather than kind of sitting here watching me do this, I have actually gone ahead and done one for us. So inside my resource pack, textures, items, I have our oh, that's not going to work. Let's open it in Paint 3D so that we can get a closer look at it. Okay, so here is our obsidian sword. Okay, so we have our texture defined. We're telling the game how to get our texture. And we have our item defined here. So we have a couple more things that we need to do in order to get this working. So the first thing we need to do is if we put this in game, then it's not going to know how to render what its name is. So we need to come into our texts folder here. And remember we had this enus.lang. We need something like this. So we're going to come into our texts folder. We're going to create an en_us.lang file. And our item is called an Eric Obsidian Sword. And its name is Obsidian Sword. And anybody feel free to stop me at any time with questions and we can kind of sort of back up and go over these things if I'm moving too fast. Okay. So the next thing we need to do is we actually need to have a behavior pack because otherwise our sword is not really going to be able to do anything. So inside behavior pack, odd, items, we're going to need to create an obsidian sword.json. Now remember, this is our behavior pack. Now, if we go to our bedrock.dev again, and inside of our documentation, we can look up the item schema for this. And we can kind of take this example item here and we'll go over what this is. So as usual, we have the format version, the version of this particular schema, the Minecraft item property where we give it a description and an identifier. And this is our Eric Obsidian Sword. And then here are the components, and similar to the entities, we add components to define how much, to define the way these things behave. So ours isn't a food. With food, we can define kind of nutritional values and things like that. Oops. We're going to unfold this. We have no interest in this, but we do have a few things that we are interested in. So this use duration is how much of the item gets used. If we set this to 0, then we get basically an indestructible sword. Let's pull up our documentation again. We've got a few others that we are looking for. Max damage. So this is how long our item lasts for. We've got hand equipped. Stacked by data. So this is if you have, say, 2 different types of stone and you want them to be able to stack. Foil is for if we want a glint. So like if you enchant an item, that's how you get sort of that flashy overlay over the top of it. How many of them can stack? And we already talked about this. So, and any effects that we want to add. And this is under food. So we're just going to take a couple of these. We want these. And we're going to drop them inside of ours. Okay. I guess we can use that stuff here. Max damage, I don't know, 1,000. It is hand equipped, so we're going to say false. Stacked by data, we don't need that. Let's go ahead and make ours have a glint. We don't need that. And because it's a weapon, there should only be one of them in a stack. Okay. If we are not missing anything, we should now be able to see our sword in game. So let's go ahead and try that out. We're going to create a new world. Okay. Let's scroll down. We want to use the experimental gameplay. We want to enable cheats so that we can give ourselves the item. And then under here, we're going to need to come in and activate our behavior pack and activate our resource pack that we created. And then we should be able to create this. Okay. So now with any luck, if we're not missing anything, we should be able to give ourselves an obsidian sword. And there it is in all its glory. Now, we can't really do much with this, right? So we've just got our sword and it works like any other sword, but we want to be able to kind of change the behavior. How does it affect the player when the player is holding it? So if we come over here and we attack one of these sheep, we're no stronger than if we didn't have a sword. So how do we change that? I'll just save and quit this real quick. So if you remember from last week, we talked about having... let's close this up for right now. And this behavior pack. And we'll look at the vanilla. So you remember we talked about these entity definitions. And this is how we could define a lot of things about an identity or an entity, like whether or not it explodes and things like that. So the player themselves is actually also an entity and has one of these definition files. So that's how we're going to accomplish this. So I'm going to try to do this as slowly as I can. If you have questions, stop me and we'll back up. So inside the vanilla behavior pack that we downloaded, you can, inside the entity folder, you can come in and find the player JSON file. We're just going to copy this entire file for right now, and we're going to put it inside of our behavior pack entities directory. Okay. So now we talked last week about our component groups and how a component group, when applied to an entity, applies all of the components within it. So that's what we want to do. So the first thing we want to do is we want to define our component group, and we're going to call it Obsidian Sword. And we need our comma to separate this property from the next one. And now let's think of a couple things that we could do. So one thing that we know we want to do is we want to make our player stronger when this sword is equipped. So if we add the Minecraft attack property to this, and I believe this is just called value, let's give it a lot. Let's say 250,000 is going to be our attack when we have this equipped. Okay, so let's come in here, and we can also do things like, you can see these here. We have the ability to add spell effects. Let's make our Obsidian Sword also let us breathe underwater. So oops. We copied it the other way. Okay. So this is remove effects. And if we look, remember, using the documentation is extremely useful. So let's come under entities, and we're going to search for spell effects. Okay. So we have two parameters that are in there. Remove effects, which is what we're looking at now, and that's just a list of things that we want to remove. We want to add. So it says it's a list. So we're going to change this to add effects. We're going to get rid of this. It's expecting a list. And let's see what it says about that list. So it looks like we have a property called effect. And I believe there's also a duration on here. So we're going to create an object, effect. I believe it's called underwater breathing. I think that's what it's called. And duration, we're going to say, I don't know, 20,000. Okay. So we've sort of defined this component group now so that when it's applied, this is what's going to happen. But now we need to figure out how to get this component group applied. Last episode, we talked about like when our target was struck, we used the hurt by player trigger to fire off an event that added this component group. So we need to figure out how we can trigger an event so that we can add the component group. But first, let's go down to our events, which are usually down here at the bottom. So we have our events. And we're going to go ahead and just copy this whole section right here. And we're going to call it Eric Obsidian Sword Equipped. And then we're going to change this to Eric Obsidian Sword. Does this all make sense? So when this Eric Obsidian Sword Equipped event gets fired, we're going to add the Eric Obsidian Sword component group to the player, and that's going to add those individual components. So next, we need to figure out how to fire that event. Now, right above it, we have this whole section called Environment Sensor. And now this will allow us to add triggers and do some checks to figure out things that are happening inside the environment or to the player, and then allow us to trigger an event. So the first thing we want to do is right here, this is an object. We're going to need to make this an array. So let's make sure we know where the bottom of it is. Okay, so this needs to be a square bracket, and this needs to be a square bracket, I believe. Oh, and then, oh no, we needed to surround it in that. Okay. Let's make sure this matches. No. Okay. Yes. So we have our array, and this is our first one. Let's go ahead and just copy this for right now. That's going to be sort of the easiest way to do this. We'll put a comma after this. We'll paste it in. And we only need to make one check. So this is an array of filters. So we could have multiple things that we're evaluating. In our case, we just want to look at one thing. So we're going to go into here and look for we can look for the filters that are available to us. And the one we're particularly interested in is this has equipment filter. And these are the parameters that are in it. So the first thing is domain. And this is asking where the item is, right? Do we have it in any location? Is it armor that we're wearing? Is it on our feet? Is it in our hand? Is it on our head, right? So this is important to us because we want to know. So we know this has equipment. The subject is looking at who has this, right? And there's a lot of things that we can do. So the subject could be whoever I'm targeting, somebody who interacted with me, somebody I'm interacting with. In this particular case, we want to know that the current player has this equipment. The value is an Eric Obsidian sword. And then we knew that we also have this domain. And we want to know that it is in our hand. Okay, so if all of this is true, oh, we need to update this to fire our Eric Obsidian Sword equipped event. So the way this should work is these environment sensors will go off. It'll compare our filters to see whether we have an Obsidian Sword in our hand. We'll fire this Eric Obsidian Sword equipped event, which will end up making this run. It will add the Eric Obsidian Sword component group. And because it adds that component group, we'll get the attack component set to 250,000. And we should have underwater breathing set, if I'm correct on what the name of that is. We can change it to something that's not 2 words, like invisibility or something, if that doesn't work. Okay, so let's load back up our game. If you were around for last episode, you know that we have to save and come back to this screen and re-enter if we want to have our behavior packs and things like that reloaded. You can reload textures inside of the game, but not behaviors. Okay. You don't have to exit the game completely. You just have to close out the world. Okay, now we have our Obsidian Sword. I think we must not have set our use because it looks like it's damaged. So let's kill this. Okay, that did not work. So this is not being applied. Let's figure out why. Say Eric Obsidian Sword. Let's just copy this. I want to make sure the attack, Minecraft attack, damage. That is why. So let me go back to that and we'll see. So the Minecraft attack component. And had I actually looked that up inside of our documentation, I would have seen that that's what that value is supposed to be. So let's go ahead and come up here and change this to damage, and then reload our world. All right, let's go kill our sheep. Yes. Okay, now, just to make sure that we really are dealing 250,000 damage, I say we summon an Ender Dragon. Oh, he got away. Nope, we are not doing 250,000 damage. That's a lot of Ender Dragons. So, do we have underwater breathing? Let's see whether this is applied. Let's go jump in the water. We may have missed something. And welcome to the world of programming, because this is actually pretty common to find bugs in your code and have to walk through it. I see water. We'll just sort of hang out over here. Nope. Okay. So that's not being applied. One thing we can do really quick is I am going to look, because I know that I implemented this already as just sort of a test. I've got on my desktop one that I was already playing with. And let's look at our items. We're going to open that with code really quick. So the use duration is 0. And what did we set ours to? I'm just looking at this really quick too, because while we're in here, I'm kind of curious why our sword okay. Let's look at our player.json too. Entities, player. Water breathing. Okay. So let's go ahead and give ourselves the instant health too. We'll just take this whole section here. I knew I had that wrong. Okay. So if we go back in, we should be able to see whether water breathing at least is applied. Okay. No. Okay, so I don't think that our event is being fired, and that's why this isn't applied. So we're going to go ahead and look here just to compare our environment sensor. Wait, this is our current one. Okay, so let's look at this. We'll go back to that. So Environment sensor, triggers, yep. Filters, has equipment, self, obsidian sword, domain, hand. Has equipment, self, Eric, obsidian, sword, hand, Eric, obsidian, sword equipped. I feel like we must have a typo here somewhere, because this all makes sense. All of test we has equipment, self, Eric, obsidian sword, domain, hand, event, Eric, obsidian sword equip, Eric, obsidian sword. I don't think that I used a namespace in my event last time. Let's try removing that and see whether that is the issue. But no, that shouldn't be. Add component groups, Eric, obsidian sword. Interesting. We're missing something. That's all typed correctly. Gotta love bugs. What are we missing? So while we're looking at this, we'll just copy this over because I don't want to run out of time, but I think we just have a typo here. So the other thing we want to look at is that once we equip this, actually let's copy this over. Just because we're running out of time. I think there's just a typo in here. And that's sort of our issue. Okay, so we just copied over the one working one that I had. So there will be one problem that we're going to have, though, and that is that, let me just come in here and, wait, no, that's not right. That didn't overwrite. And we're going to go into behavior packs, entities. Why did that not copy? I just want to make sure we get through this. Okay, so now our player.json's in here. There's an additional thing that we have done, though. So what we ended up doing here is our obsidian sword. This is actually a fun thing that I did too. We could scale. so that when we equip our sword, our character grows bigger. So I'm going to just delete this really quick, and we'll explain why that's there in just a second. I think that we've got a naming issue here, because I don't think that it detects. It was not our player.json that was the problem, it seems. Oh no, we have our underwater breathing. So that does work. Okay. So if that's true, then we should be able to summon another Ender Dragon and kill it in one shot. Or close to one shot, it looks like. Okay. So the one issue that we have now is that if we switch away from our weapon, we're still going to have the effects. So the water breathing, the instant health, all of these things that we gave ourselves because we equipped the obsidian sword, the second we take it out of our hand, nothing fires. So that's what this is. So we created a component group for a normal player, set its attack at 1 so that we bring our damage back to normal. We set our scale back to 1 so that we're smaller, and we remove the effects that we have on ourselves. So now we need to make this event fire. How do we add this component group? And so what we did was, in events, there's a reset player event that I created. And we added the component group normal player and removed the component group obsidian sword. Now we need a way to get this event to fire. And we did that the same way as we did with the has equipment. Except what we used was filters that test if something, our subject, is in a particular family. Our subject is ourselves, and the value is player. So are we a player? And if we're a player, we reset. And because this filter no longer matches, it never gets fired to override it. So now if we come in here and load this back up, okay, so the next thing I want to do, we don't have very much time left, so we're not going to get into like really creating our own entity and animating it and things like that. We will show off just a little bit of just customization. So let's go in to our add-ons here. And we don't really care about that. We're going to go into our resource packs. We have, let's take the creeper animation controller. And I kind of explained what that did. We'll move that over into our animation controllers. Then we need the entity itself. We're going to grab the creeper entity definition. And we're going to put that inside of ours. Now we also need the model, which defines what it looks like. So we're going to come in here and grab our creeper geometry. And we're going to put that inside of our models entity. A couple more things. Now we need the render controller for our creeper. And we have two different versions, whether or not it has armor. So let's put that inside of ours. And now we just need our textures. Textures, entity, creeper. Okay, so now we should have our own creeper inside of our mod, except our creeper, because it, oh, I already put it in here. Okay, so, oh, there we go. Okay, so because our creeper definition uses the same exact ID as the main game, this is just going to override the creeper in the game. And so let's have a little fun. We're going to go into the model here, make sure we're in our mod. And we're going to open this up inside of BlockBench so that we can modify it. Okay. We're going to just modify this one and not the charged creeper. And our textures did not load. Textures, entity, creeper. Okay, so here's our creeper. And we're just going to go ahead and duplicate this block. And now our creeper has two heads. So we're going to take one, and we're going to put it off to the side over here. And we're going to take the other, and we're going to put it off to the side here. And now we have a bunch of different things too. So we could resize the creeper's head. That's going to throw off our texture packs a little bit though. So we're not going to do that too much. We can take the head and rotate it. Oops, there we go. And then this tells it what we're pivoting on when we're rotating. And I mean, we could go through a bunch of tutorials as far as how to use BlockBench. You can come over here and do things with modifying the textures. We can do animations. And if we had an entity, so let me go ahead and save this really quick because we're going to use this. But while we're in here, I'll demonstrate one more thing too. So if we came over here and we opened a recent, oh, I think I may have deleted these. Yeah, I did. But if we had an item, we could also, let's just, we're going to create a new Bedrock model. Test. Okay. I have a plugin installed here for this Bedrock entity generator that we could use. Oh, these are entities. The next episode we'll demonstrate kind of creating like a 3D item and what does it look like inside somebody's hand. Because there's a cool little feature in here where we can click to like see it inside of a character's hand or see it sitting on the ground, and then we can tweak that. But I think doing 3D modeling will have to be an episode all of its own. So let's go ahead and see whether we have a two-headed creeper. Something's up with our rendering. What viewpoint am I in? Okay. So let's summon a creeper. And there's our two-headed creeper. But you see how its legs move? Those are our animations. So we're out of time for this week. I'll take a few minutes to answer questions and things like that. But maybe next week we'll walk through creating a character, animating it, and some of the additional things that we can do. Sounds, maybe we'll get to those as we're building stuff. Those are pretty straightforward. Particles, so the fact that I have these little things floating from me because of the effect I have, or the particles that fly when I hit that. We could talk a little bit about that. But what I'd really like to is maybe we'll spend next episode talking about that. And then the following episode, I really want to get into programming so that we can start building code that runs on the server side and client side so that we can start introducing functionality to our items, to our entities that does not exist as a component already that we can play with. And this is things, we could create our own UI components. We could create a scoreboard, things like that. We could build in mini games, like we could build, tic-tac-toe or something with blocks. It's really limitless. We could create, a little window down here, a little kill window, where it starts telling anytime somebody kills a creature or kills another player, we could have that come up on screen. Get creative, actually. Send me ideas and we'll start implementing those. But once we've kind of gone over the foundations of stuff, then what I'd like to do is come up with a large add-on. And then every week we'll just get on for an hour or two and work through feature by feature, character by character. I'm not the best 3D modeler or texture designer. I can play with it and come up with something, but we'll get help with that, or maybe some of you can contribute. But yeah, we'll just work our way through a really big add-on, just feature by feature, until we complete it. And then there'll be a lot to kind of learn along the way. And now the fun thing about all of this when we get into it is a lot of these technologies that you're learning are very useful, even outside the context of Minecraft. So JSON is a format that's used between services on the internet to communicate quite a bit. Your browser, what's running inside your browser communicating back to the server, uses JSON a lot. It's the same way you define the types inside the JavaScript language. And then when we learn the JavaScript programming language, that can be used to write server-side code. It can be used to write code that runs in the browser. When we get into building UI components, which may actually be another episode before we start building the add-ons themselves, that's all done through HTML, which is the same markup language that's used to build websites. So all of these technologies that you're going to learn doing this apply elsewhere. There's no reason you couldn't be able to build a website after learning these things. So before we call it quits, did anybody have any questions on anything we went over? Is there any aspects of Minecraft development that you're really intrigued by that you want to make sure that I cover? All right, I guess we will call that quits for this week, and I look forward to seeing you next week, where maybe we can work on some custom animations and things like that, or we can come back to that and we can move forward with code and come back to animations. I'm perfectly okay either way, but I look forward to seeing you next week. Make sure to subscribe, either whether you're watching this on YouTube or Twitch. Make sure to subscribe so that you get a notification when I come back on. But this should be a every Friday 1 p.m. Eastern time for now until we get bored with it. Thanks, everybody.